Hello everyone, welcome back. Once again, I'm your instructor Vernon Creviston, and in today's lecture we're going to kind of pick up where we left off, so to speak, kind of explaining the significance of this thing called the 7 Years' War, why it mattered, what impact it had, and then kind of launch into something that follows very quickly after this monumental victory for Great Britain, this thing called the American Revolution. So today what we're going to kind of look at is where this revolution comes from, why this empire starts fragmenting apart almost the minute it is established, right? Once Britain puts together this worldwide empire, it finds out it has a lot of problems, especially with some of its oldest colonies, the American colonies. So that's what we're going to do today, is kind of see where this revolution comes from, what's driving it. And one of the things I need you to understand here is we're going to be, over the next couple of lectures, looking at a long arc of transition here, right? It doesn't start out as a revolution. We as historians, we say the revolution runs from essentially 1765 to 1789. That generation, if you will, is the period of the American Revolution. But it doesn't start out as a revolution. Nobody in the American colonies in 1765 is saying, hey, let's create our own country. That takes time. And even when they do decide, let's create our own country, they're still not entirely sure what that country should look like or how it should work. So there's a lot to do here during this long period called the American Revolution. What really starts out as, not as a revolution, but as resistance to British policies. It is British subjects telling a British government, we don't like that, change that, don't do that. And then that resistance begins to morph into rebellion, right? And rebellion is different than revolution. That is also important to kind of keep in mind. A rebellion is when you won't acknowledge the authority of your government because of the people that are in power. What I mean by that is you're rebelling against the people in charge because you want your people in charge, but you're not getting rid of the government per se. The mechanisms are fine. It's just the people in charge are who you're upset with. Revolution is when you say, I don't even think that government is legitimate. I won't even listen to the entire government. I want something else, something new. That, again, is this long arc, right? We're going to see how they go from just resisting British authority to rebelling against British authority to saying, now we're not even interested in being British anymore. And that doesn't happen automatically. We can see this transition take place. That's why we as historians say the American Revolution starts in 1765. But to them, those people at the time, that is not what they're about, as we'll look at in today's lecture. They're actually doing something much different at the beginning. It's more about resistance than revolution. So that's kind of what we need to do is understand this process as it plays out here in the 1760s and the 1770s. So to do that, we're going to kind of, again, start with the 7 Years' War and kind of remind ourselves of what happened there and what is important. But before we get there, I do want to remind you about something I've said a couple times now in some of my lectures. The people living in these colonies, they are not united by any one particular thing other than being British, right? They don't have the same political structures, although in general it's true. Specifically, each colony kind of run things a little differently. They don't have the same religious institutions in every colony. There are different people, different churches, different groups in all of these colonies. And their economic interests, while in general are the same, make money, be successful, how they do it is very different. New England does it through trade. Agriculture is the middle colonies and in the southern colonies. They're not doing things all the same way. Another thing we have to kind of disabuse ourselves is the notion that they see themselves as Americans. They definitely do not, especially at the end of the 7 Years' War. They really see themselves as British subjects, right? They fought with the British Empire. They fought for the British Empire, and they're proud to be British. If anything, if you were to push an American colonist and say, well, what are you? They would say, oh, I'm a British subject. And they'd say, yeah, we get that. But what are you after that? Then they would say, well, I'm a Massachusettsman or a Virginian or a Marylander, that kind of stuff. They don't think of themselves as a thing called an American yet. Again, that's a process that has to take place, especially in opposition to the British Empire. You have to start thinking of yourself as something else when you say, I'm no longer part of that group, right? And that's when the idea of being a Virginian and an American starts to kind of really take off, right? But keep in mind, these colonies are independent little places working within this bigger thing called the British Empire. Now, as I mentioned, we really have to look at why the 7 Years' War is such a game changer. We did a little bit of that in our last lecture where we mentioned just how important this war was in really rising Britain up in the ranks of nations in Europe. It has become a worldwide empire, but it's going to have more import than just that. It's not only made France less powerful and more willing to kind of try to get revenge if it can against Britain, but it's going to impact Britain and her colonies in a lot of different ways, and we're going to take a look at that today. And then we're going to kind of go through this, the beginnings of this resistance and into this rebellion throughout this lecture. So a couple things to kind of keep in mind. As I showed you in that painting by Benjamin West, a lot of people understood that the reason Britain won this big victory over France wasn't because Britain itself was so powerful, but because its colonies were becoming powerful, right? They gave a lot of support to the British war effort. There were a lot of American colonists fighting with the British, for the British, that helped win this war. So it was this coalition, the British Empire coming together, that made such a big difference in defeating France. Also, keep in mind, the 7 Years' War doesn't cause the American Revolution. We're not talking about going straight from the war against France to a war against Britain. American colonists aren't there yet. Again, this is about resisting the British policies that come about after the war, not necessarily about a revolution. And really the way to think about it is that there's really a difference in the relationship between Britain and her colonies because the empire has changed, as I'll show you in just a few minutes. The way Britain treats her colonies is going to change as well. And that change is what is going to start this resistance between some of Britain's colonies. Also, a big thing to kind of keep in mind here is the 7 Years' War was a disaster for France, but it was just as much a disaster for Native Americans. Most of them fought with the French. A few fought with the British because their enemies were siding with the French. But for the most part, when France loses, the natives lose their best ally. The one European power that didn't ask anything of them, that didn't take anything from them, that's now gone. Native Americans are going to find themselves at the mercy of the British Empire and those British colonists. And that, of course, is bad for natives. The last thing we want to remind ourselves of, we'll remember this probably from high school and from junior high and even from grade school, is that this war was expensive. The Prime Minister of Great Britain is a hero for winning this war. His name's William Pitt. It's why we named the city Pittsburgh in honor of him, right? There's all kinds of towns in the middle colonies in the New England area that are named after William Pitt because he was the leader of this great victory. But it was a tremendously costly victory, not just in lives, but the amount of money. Raising troops, sending armies off, building ships to transport those armies, feeding those armies, clothing those armies. They cost a lot of money. Britain has spent a tremendous amount of money winning this war, and now, of course, needs to pay that debt down. And of course, they're going to look to their colonies, all of them, but especially these American colonies who really haven't followed a lot of Britain's rules up to this point. They're going to expect those colonists who've gained so much from this war to help pay that debt down. So we can kind of see the seeds of this discontent from the minute this war is over being planted here. Natives aren't going to be happy. American colonists may not be happy. Britain may not be happy. There's a lot of work still to be done, even as they celebrate this great victory. So that's something I want you to kind of keep in mind here. This was a tremendous victory for Great Britain. No matter what, France and her ally Spain lose a lot here. They lose control over vast parts of North America. They lose islands in the Caribbean, Central America. They even lose portions of their empires in Asia. France loses India. Spain loses the Philippines, at least for a little while, to Great Britain. Great Britain is a worldwide empire now. There are people living in the British Empire that aren't British now. By taking over Canada, the French Empire in North America, you've now got 50, 60,000 French people that live in the British Empire. Nominally, they're British subjects now, but of course they speak French, they act French, they're Catholics, not Protestants. What do you do with them? You've got India now if you're Britain. They're definitely not European. They're not, they're not English, right? They're not British. What do you do with them? How do you run that colony? What do you do with all of these different places that Britain now controls? So the nature of the empire has changed, but the needs of the empire have also changed. Remember, the whole point of having empires from the very beginning, when Sir Walter Raleigh proposed to Queen Elizabeth starting the Roanoke colony, the whole point of having colonies is to build up the wealth of the home country, the mother country. Either through finding wealth like gold, like the Spanish did with the Aztecs and the Inca, or other types of mineral wealth, or just commerce. Well, in the end, for the British Empire, because they never find a wealthy native tribe to loot like the Spanish do, they have to do this commercially, right? They need those colonies to grow, to buy goods from the home country, to provide raw materials to the home country so that economy can continue to grow. And one of the ways these colonies pay for all of this, pay for themselves, is paying taxes, what are called duties on trade, right? That's the way the system's supposed to work. Colonies exist to send things back to the home country, to buy things from the home country. Colonies pay taxes on this trade, and that helps protect the empire and helps run the empire. So in the end, this is supposed to be a mutually beneficial arrangement. If you're Britain, you have guaranteed markets for the goods you produce. You also have raw materials for your economy that you wouldn't otherwise have through these colonies. The colonies also gain military protection, like in the 7 Years' War. Once the colonies finally got their act together and said, no, you have to come protect us, Britain had to send armies. It was the only way they were going to keep their colonies. So it is supposed to be kind of a bilateral agreement here. The colonies supply and provide for the home country. The home country supplies and provides for their colonies as well. Another big thing that's supposed to happen here is if you're a colonist in this empire, you're supposed to be able to use credit. Right? You may not have cash on hand. As a matter of fact, one of the big problems for the British Empire is constantly the fact that they don't have a lot of gold and silver. They never find any in their colonies. They don't have any in Great Britain. They have to get it from other sources. So really, in a world that runs on gold and silver as their cash, Britain has never had a lot of it. It means a lot of people have to take out credit from each other. I owe you, you owe him, you transfer my debt from you to him, now I owe him and he owes me, right? We'll work out a deal between us. Well, the colonists are supposed to have that access to credit as well. So if you can't afford to buy something from a manufacturer in Britain, but you want those goods, you're supposed to be able to take out credit and then say, when my next year crop comes in, or when we get another load of furs in, or when we harvest some trees, whatever resource it is that you're tied to, then I'll pay off my debt with you, right? And that's the way this system is supposed to work. This empire is supposed to work basically for everybody, but mostly for Great Britain. After all, they're the ones that create these colonies. They're the ones that protect these colonies. But it's never quite worked that way. The British have never quite gotten a lot of the taxes that they're supposed to collect from this trade from their colonists. It's never actually been flowing to them. Remember, back in those navigation acts, there was never really any mechanism for enforcement. There was kind of the basic groundwork for it, but it was never actually actively participated in by England or Britain before. But here, after the 7 Years' War, that has to change. This empire's way bigger. There's way more parts to it. There are new people in it. You need everybody to kind of do their thing now, to follow the rules to make this work. So in 1763, William Pitt, the hero of this war, decides he's going to take his victory lap and leave. He understands there's a lot of work to be done here, and his health is just not up to it. After the stress of fighting this war for 4 years, he's decided that it's best for him to kind of retire from the prime minister and just become a member of the House of Lords. So now this British Empire has to reorganize itself, and it especially has to figure out a way to pay down its debt. The figure that most historians agree on is essentially Britain owes about 145 million pounds. The British pound is their unit of measure for their currency, like the US dollar is for us. Now, 145 million in our terms today doesn't sound like a whole lot, but it is the equivalent of about 10, 12 trillion for us today. So that would be like our debt in this country going from 20 trillion to 30 trillion after fighting a war. It's a lot. It seems like a staggering amount of money, and a lot of people are wondering, can we actually pay this much debt off? And of course, one of the things that Britain's going to expect is their colonies, all of them, including these new ones, but also the old ones like the American colonies, to actually start paying these taxes, to actually pay those duties on trade items so that Britain can pay down this monstrous debt. A debt that it incurred, remember, defending those colonies from France. So to the British, this makes sense. We'll have to see how the American colonists react to it, right? Do they see things the same way? What is really kind of interesting, though, to me, is that the new British Prime Minister that takes over after William Pitt retires, his name is George Grenville. And his first action is not necessarily to pay down the debt, but is to actually start organizing this empire. And one of the things he asks for is his king, George III, who's now inherited the throne after his father, George II, dies. He asked the new king of England, who's only been on the throne for a couple of years, to put out an edict, a proclamation, what we would today call an executive order. That executive order, called the Proclamation of 1763, actually didn't have anything to do with taxes or paying down the debt. It had to do with separating these different parts of the empire. What this proclamation did is it drew a line on a map, creating a border, a western border, for those American colonies, essentially saying to those colonists in Massachusetts, New York, Virginia, Pennsylvania, that had these vast claims of western lands, no, you don't. You now have a border on your western side, essentially following the chain of hills called the Appalachian Mountains that run along the eastern seaboard, kind of separating kind of the eastern seaboard from the interior where a lot of these big river systems are, like the Ohio and the Mississippi rivers. What this proclamation said was American colonists, British subjects living in the American colonies, had to stay on the eastern side of this imaginary line. Who's on the other side, the western side? Well, that was reserved for those French Canadians that are now British subjects and the Native Americans. Native Americans, if they live on the eastern side of this line, they need to move. They're going to be forced out. It is not their land anymore. But on the same side, American colonists can't go across this border and take native lands anymore. If they have lands on the other side that they've claimed, they need to move back on the other side of the line. This actually makes sense from the point of view of the British government. The last thing you need is these groups of people, these French colonists that are now British, these American colonists who are British, and these Native Americans who are now under British control. The last thing you need is them fighting over land and who controls it. By separating them out, you kind of quiet things down and make it possible for the British to kind of keep an organization going. But once again, there's a fatal flaw here. The British government isn't going to send troops to actually enforce these lines. They just expect their colonial governments in the American colonies to actually enforce it for them. But most of these colonial governments have just fought a war for the past 8 years to gain that land out west. They hate this proclamation. They say that this is exactly against what they fought the war for. Even some members of parliament say, hey, wait a minute. The whole point of that war was this land belongs to those colonists, and now we're saying it doesn't belong to them, it belongs to the French and the natives that were the enemy? So this seems pretty confusing to a lot of people. Now, luckily for the American colonists, because there aren't enough British troops out there to enforce this, they can ignore this law just like they have virtually any other law Britain's put out that they don't like. But again, it shows us that the views have changed here. For Britain, they have a whole different group of people, several groups of people, that they need to now manage. They don't just have American colonists to keep happy anymore. They have all kinds of other groups of people to keep happy as well. This is going to be happening across their empire, trying to make sure that they have these different parts working together without a lot of friction, because that's bad for the British government. But if you're an American colonist, it seems like your government is actually looking out for the interests of the conquered people that you fought against rather than you. There is a lot of resentment here. And then it starts to grow after that, right? Resentment is going to start to switch to resistance. Because after Grenville gets this proclamation from the king, he then starts getting through Parliament and the king a series of acts to actually pay down that debt, to start taxing these colonies and getting Britain's finances in order. The first one that they pass is on one of the most important commodities traded anywhere in the world at the time, and that, of course, is sugar. Now, up to this point, British sugar was some of the most taxed sugar in the world. And when we say duties and taxes, what we mean is merchants had to pay the government a certain amount of money. In this case, 6 pence or 6 pennies on a gallon of sugar. Sugar was usually liquefied into what we call molasses today to transport it because it stayed good longer. It was easier to transport in barrels as a liquid than turning into a granular that could be attacked by insects, that kind of stuff. So they transported it in barrels by gallons. And ostensibly, merchants had to pay the government 6 pennies on every gallon of sugar. Now, the problem was that made British sugar some of the most expensive sugar in the world. If you were an American colonist, especially one of those New England merchants, you knew you could go down and buy French, Spanish, or Dutch sugar in the Caribbean at way lower costs. And as a matter of fact, they were doing that all the time, buying foreign sugar that was supposed to be illegal under the Navigation Acts, passing it off as English or British sugar, and selling it anywhere in the empire and making a good profit. They even did that during the 7 Years' War. While they were fighting France and Spain, American merchants would go down into the Caribbean to those French and Spanish islands and trade with the enemy. So these American colonists are used to doing whatever they want that's good for them, and that kind of is obvious. So you kind of understand where Britain's coming from here. We want you to actually start paying these taxes, but Britain also understands the tax is too high, so they slash it in half. They say, look, we're only going to ask you to pay 3 pennies on the gallon now, but we actually expect you to pay it. We're going to send out customs officials to actually make sure you pay this tax. And oh yeah, don't buy foreign sugar anymore. We're going to make sure you don't buy foreign sugar either. This drives a lot of American colonists berserk. because now they actually have to pay this tax, which is going to mean that they don't have access to the cheap sugar anymore. They won't make as much money. They actually might not make any money on transporting sugar in the British Empire. So they start saying, no, we refuse to do this. But there's not a whole lot they can do. Slowly but surely, customs officials are sent out by the British government and they start enforcing this tax. But some American merchants say, fine, we'll just do illegal activities. We'll just smuggle it outside the normal channels of commerce and keep making our profits that way. So you kind of see there's already some growing resistance to British authority. It's always been there, actually, but now it's becoming kind of legitimized because of British actions. Britain wants the colonies to actually start following the rules. A lot of the colonists who have never had to follow these rules before have said, no, I choose not to. And then it just goes from there, right? On the heels of this Sugar Act that gets a lot of British merchants in the American colonies upset comes news of another one that gets a lot of consumers in the American colonies upset. This is a thing called the Currency Act. This act is to outlaw paper money. During the 7 Years' War, a lot of American colonies, like Virginia, Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, had turned to printing paper money. Now remember, there isn't a lot of gold and silver floating around. And because of the disruptions in the war, there wasn't a lot of ways to get credit. You never knew who was going to be in business, if your credit was good with that person. So a lot of colonies, especially to pay off their war debts, to pay troops, to raise food for the troops that they had to during the war, they had taken to putting out paper money. Essentially IOUs saying, hey, we will pay you back when we get the money, or we'll give you goods and services in exchange in equal value to this paper currency. Most colonists have been using paper currency for a long time to pay their personal debts with each other. But the problem was those paper monies were only good in the colonies where they were issued. Paper money in New Jersey was only good in New Jersey. What had been happening after the war, however, is a lot of colonists that wanted British goods were paying in their colonial money to British merchants. British merchants would prefer that the colonists take out credit, but credit is expensive. There's interest on it. A lot of American colonists didn't want to keep doing business with the same merchants over and over again. So they said, no, I want to pay in paper money. And they forced British merchants to take their money. But that money is worthless to British merchants because they're not going to buy anything from those colonies. So British merchants went to the British government and said, look, make these guys pay in gold and silver or take out credit. That's the way the system's supposed to work. So the British government says, you know, you're right. Let's make this paper money worthless, outlaw it. They have to take out credit or pay in gold and silver. Well, this just upsets colonists again, right? Not only can we go move, we're not supposed to be able to move westwards and take lands that we thought we were fighting for in the war. Now you want us to pay taxes on goods when we could buy them cheaper someplace else. And now you're telling us we have to pay the most expensive way we possibly can, either with gold and silver that we don't have or taking out credit that costs too much. So colonists are getting angry and more angry all the time. And then comes news of another act on top of all of these. This one's called the Quartering Act. The British government says, look, as part of the British Empire, your job is to help defend the British Empire. We're going to send troops to the colonies, and we expect you to build forts for them to live in, and we expect you to help feed them. Now, Britain will continue to pay them and clothe them and arm them, but the colonies need to build forts and help feed those troops. After all, they're there to protect you. But a lot of colonists say, wait a minute, who are you protecting us from? The natives and the French are defeated. Spain's a long ways away. Why do you need to send troops to Boston or New York or Philadelphia? That seems kind of crazy to us. Maybe on the frontier between where the French are and the natives are, but I see no reason for why they should be in these big port cities. A lot of American colonists convinced themselves those troops aren't there actually to protect them from some foreign power. Those troops are there to make sure they start following all these new rules. So a lot of Americans are already starting to get very wary of their government, very, very unsure as to what this government really is trying to do here. And then comes news of the act that they are sure means they're about to be forced to submit to Britain, unlike any way they've ever been forced to submit to Britain. And that, of course, is a thing called the Stamp Act. This one really does change the relationship of the American colonies with Great Britain. It's why historians call this the start of the American Revolution. So what is this act that launches this incredibly long, drawn-out process called the American Revolution? Well, in and of itself, the Stamp Act, it makes sense from the side of the British government. Britain has been taxing virtually everything from sugar to China, right, to silverware, you name it, there's a tax on it. Well, they also have taxes on paper. Paper, before the internet, before computers, is the way you conducted business. It's the way you got your information through newspapers. It's the way you entertained yourself through books and pamphlets. It's the way you communicated legal work through documents, right? It was the way the world ran. So it was incredibly useful, it was incredibly valuable, and it was very commonplace. So to the British government, it makes sense to slap a new tax on paper as a way to raise revenue, to make money and pay down the debt. Everybody has to use paper. Everybody will have to pay this tax. So any paper that's going to be printed or used needs to have a stamp put on it to show that it has had a tax collected from it. But there's a big difference now than ever. The first thing is this tax was specifically supposed to help fund the army that was being sent out to places like India, the Philippines, and the American colonies to protect them. So this was kind of a clear-cut reason behind this tax, to try and fund those militaries so that Britain's debt wouldn't go up. But then something else kind of novel about it happened. All the other taxes before this, they were just taxes that the government collected money that it spent on whatever it needed to spend on. This was a tax that had a direct purpose. It was also direct in the nature of who would pay it. All other duties, these trade taxes, were collected by merchants. Merchants paid the government and then passed the cost of those taxes on in the price of the goods. You, the consumer, never actually paid those taxes directly. This one is different. The Stamp Act, you, the consumer, when you buy that newspaper, when you get that legal document made, will pay the tax at the time you take possession of the paper. The person selling you the paper, whether it be a newspaper, a book, or what have you, will stamp it and you'll pay that extra tax. So you pay for the item you're buying, the newspaper, and then you'll pay the tax on top of that. You, the consumer. And oh yeah, because of the Currency Act, you have to pay this in gold and silver. Well, a lot of American colonists say, hey, wait, this is changing the game here, right? Answer to what a direct tax is it's a tax paid directly by the customer, the consumer, when they purchased an item. None of Britain's taxes had ever been done that way. They had always been trade taxes, right? Duties, hidden in the cost of the items. The only people that paid direct taxes to Parliament were people living in Britain, Scotland, and Wales. All the people in the colonies had always just paid those indirect taxes, those duties on trade goods. If they paid a direct tax, it was through their local colonial legislatures. That's who they paid direct taxes to, and that made sense to them. That legislature is mine. I vote for it. It has control over me because I give it control. Therefore, if it passes a tax, it's a legal tax that I have to pay. But none of these colonists vote for members of Parliament. None of these colonists have a say in these taxes being put out by Parliament. And they go, that's wrong. A direct tax should only come from a government that you vote for, that you have representation in. So this sentiment goes sweeping through the colonies. They say, look, this is a game changer. This is wrong. They start issuing those words, no taxation without representation. Parliament can't directly tax me because I'm not represented in Parliament. You want to put a duty on paper? That's fine. Put a duty on paper. The merchants will pay it, and then we'll pay the merchants through the inflated price. But don't ask me to pay a tax to the government directly when I'm not getting a chance to vote or to have representation keep that tax from being affecting me, right? So they start organizing themselves throughout the colonies. And when I say throughout the colonies, I mean literally every town in the American colonies. And heck, some even in Canada and the Caribbean hold protests saying this is wrong, this is illegal. The British Parliament cannot do a direct tax. That is new and novel and never been done before. They start saying we're not going to collect this tax, because to pay this tax is to give authority, to say that I'm okay with the British government doing this. And the fear here is today they're directly taxing paper. Tomorrow it'll be sugar. And then it'll be something else. And pretty soon there'll be a whole bunch of taxes we can't afford to pay because we have to pay in gold and silver or take out credit. We can't pay in our colonial money. This is bad for us. So they start organizing throughout the colonies. They pull together in response to their own government's initiative a new meeting. Now remember, in 1754, the British government asked the colonies to come together to fight their war against the French and the natives. The British government said, leave us out of this, you guys take care of it. The colonists said, no, we're British, you have to come help us. And the British government did. Now in 1765, the colonists actually get together. 9 of the 13 American colonies meet in a Stamp Act Congress in New York and agree that we should not pay this tax, that we need Britain to pull this tax back, that it is illegal. But they understand something. They're not going to get Britain's attention because they have no representation in Parliament. So they're going to have to find a new way to get Britain's attention, right? To tell Britain, you need to pay attention to us. And they come up with a unique solution. They're not going to buy British goods. And that is an incredibly important thing to think about. These colonies, because there's so many people living in them now, maybe 1.5 million, 1.75 million people, they're on their way to 2 million by this point. They buy a lot of British goods. About 1 out of 3 things sold in the British Empire is sold in these 13 American colonies. They're doing pretty well here. They're not fabulously rich by any stretch of the imagination, but they are a lot of people and they buy a lot of British things. So the idea here is we won't buy British goods. We will boycott British goods, and that way we'll get the attention of British merchants who aren't selling a lot of stuff, and they'll put pressure on Parliament, who will pull back this really awful tax. So this happens, right? And think about that. They couldn't get together, these colonies, to fight an enemy that they'd been fighting for 100 years, the French and their native allies. But they could come together to oppose their own government, right? They actually feel that this is so bad that they're willing to work together across the way. Part of the explanation here is the things like the Great Awakening that had made these colonists get to know each other. Fighting in the 7 Years' War allowed these colonies to work together, to have contact with each other, right? Working with the British government. So they know each other a lot better. There's a lot more communication going on between these colonies than ever before. It actually makes this non-importation agreement possible. They begin stopping the purchase of British goods. But they're still going to need paper. They're still going to want sugar. Where are they going to get it from? Well, that's where those smugglers come in. A lot of merchants, people like John Hancock, one of the wealthiest people in the colony of Massachusetts, maybe in the entire American colonies, he's illegally going to go out and purchase paper from other European colonies. He'll purchase sugar from wherever and smuggle it in, sneak it in, pass it off as British stuff that's already been taxed without paying the tax, or just bringing it in illegally without anybody checking it and selling it to merchants. But the idea here is don't buy British goods. Buy it from somewhere else or do without for as long as you can to try and get the British government to back down. And it is amazingly effective. Within about a year's time, British merchants who have seen their profits slashed in half, or maybe their business is threatening to go out of business, start putting pressure on Parliament. Say, look, these colonists, they buy a lot of stuff from us and they're not buying anything, right? Doesn't matter what it is, they won't buy it. You need to repeal this tax so they'll go back to buying stuff so the economy will build up. As a matter of fact, Britain's actually making less money on its taxes than ever before because American colonists won't pay any taxes on anything. So in the end, Britain is forced to repeal this tax, what's known as the Declaratory Act. But it adds something else to this act. The British Parliament says, we choose to repeal this tax because we think it's in the best interest of the empire. But we believe we have the formal ability to put taxes whatsoever we want on anything we want. Essentially, Britain is saying, we have the power to put this tax on if we want. We just choose to stop taxing you at this time. Now, if you're an American colonist, that level of sophistication really doesn't mean anything to you, right? That interpretation doesn't mean anything to you. You wanted them to repeal the tax. They did. You won. If you're the British government, you look bad here. You've backed down. They stood up to you. You blinked. You gave in. You have to cover yourself here and say, yes, we gave in this time, but we may not next time. It's totally in our power as to what we do with these taxes. What we essentially see is nothing is resolved here. If you're the British colonists living in the American colonies, you think you just stood up to your government listened, and they're going to listen to what you want. But if you're the British government, you see these colonists as resentful, right? They're not doing their duty. They're not paying taxes like everybody else. Heck, people in Britain have to keep paying this tax. People in other parts of the empire have to keep paying this tax. Why shouldn't these colonists keep paying this tax? This just doesn't seem right if you're the British government. So there's something incredibly powerful happening here, right? And it's not getting resolved by any stretch of the imagination. Another thing we have to kind of keep in mind is how this non-importation agreement actually worked, right? And what we have here, what's on screen, is a flyer that would have been put up by these people enforcing this boycott. They're calling themselves patriots, right? They're defending their British rights. There's the idea that a British government can't put a direct tax on you if you don't have representation, right? They think that they're this is a perfectly legal resistance to British policy. So look at what this flyer says and kind of the attitude that's happening here and what really makes this non-importation work, okay? So let me read it to you. So Vo Patria, and that's a Latin term that just means the patriots, right? So it's put out by these patriots, these people saying they're defending their British rights from the British government. Look at what they have to say here. The first man that either distributes or makes use of stamped paper, let him take care of his house, person, or effects. Vox populi, that means the voice of the people, we dare. So what are they saying here? So they're putting these flyers up all over the place, like in New York and Boston and Philadelphia. And essentially these patriots, these people organizing this resistance to the British government, are saying, look, if we catch you paying this tax, if we catch you trying to sell taxed paper, we're coming after you. Look at what they say. Take care of your house. What do they mean by that? They mean literally that if they find out you're one of the people selling this stamped paper, and they give you examples of it over on the side there, if we see you buying or selling this stuff, we're going to come to your house and tear it apart. Now, it doesn't mean that they're going to steal anything, but they could take all the stuff that's inside and throw it outside and not be gentle in the process. They can break your furniture, break all your china and your glass. They don't care. They're making their point. They could also do something that was called house pulling. They could bring ropes with them. Most of these are seaside towns and cities, so they have a lot of sailors around. There's a lot of people that work in the shipping industry. They have lots of rope. They'll bring that rope, they'll tie it to your house, and they will literally pull your house apart and destroy everything in it. They are that serious. Heck, they're even talking about you personally. We may just take you out and beat you up for buying or selling British product, for paying these taxes. We dare. So sometimes we kind of think about this part of the American Revolution as being kind of about ideas and people arguing to each other and writing letters to each other, and they're definitely doing all of that. But there's also a real threat of violence here. There are people being hurt. There are livelihoods being destroyed here. If you're a good British subject, you're a merchant in Boston, and you just want to do your part and help your country and just pay your taxes like a good person, these guys are saying, we're coming after you. You're scared. You want British soldiers there to protect you from these people that you think are crazy and dangerous. So you kind of see that the stakes are getting pretty high pretty quickly here. And this is very impactful to a lot of people. Their lives are going to be changed because of these boycotts, because of British policies, and this resistance that's starting to build up in these colonies. And another thing to kind of keep in mind, what is the British government saying to these patriots, as they call themselves, when they repeal the tax? Well, in essence, they've said they won, right? So now these patriots think, hey, this worked. We can just do this anytime we have a problem. And indeed, we'll see them come back to this over and over and over again. It works. It's a method that has proven effective. So this is absolutely critical. Now, in the aftermath of the repeal of the Stamp Act, a lot of people think, okay, this is over, right? It's okay now. A lot of American colonists convinced themselves the British government, Parliament has learned its lessons. They won't do that anymore. We'll go back to normal and everything's fine. The empire's back to the way it was. But in reality, nothing has really changed. And what we want to kind of look at here is, where does this idea of being able to resist government policy even come from? Why are colonists suddenly fighting against their own government when they wouldn't have done it 50 or 60 years earlier? Well, part of the reasons for that, what's happening here, what's fueling a lot of this opposition, is coming at about a time called the Enlightenment, right? What is also known as the Age of Reason. Here in the 16th and especially the 17th centuries, the world is changing a little bit intellectually, right? The medieval period and even the Renaissance has kind of fallen away and been replaced with a much more science-based world, a world where you want to figure things out and where you, the individual, have a lot of agency, a lot of control over your life. You see it over and over again in different ways. Things like the Great Awakening, even though it's a religious movement, is very much fueled by this enlightenment, this idea that you, the individual, can fix the world. The Glorious Revolution, you can fix politics, right? If we have bad kings, we can get rid of them and put good kings in their place. A lot of this reasoning, these ideas that are floating around during this period are all about how to get human societies to work together better and to quit looking for superstition or magic as a way to solve problems and just have individuals figure it out for themselves, right? So there's less and less of an emphasis on, well, this is just God's will. If something bad happened to you, God must be angry with you. People at this point are starting to say, no, if something bad happened to you, there might be an actual reason why something bad happened to you. You caught a disease because you were around somebody that came from some other part of the world where those diseases were present, right? They still don't understand microbes and mosquito vectors and all that, but they're starting to figure some of this stuff out. They're starting to understand that if your house gets struck by lightning, it is not because God hates you, it's because there's a big electrical storm in the area and your roof was higher than other people's roofs. That's why it hit your house and not somebody else's house. So think about guys like Ben Franklin, who's doing his experiments in electricity. He's explaining how these things are happening. You don't have to rely on biblical stories or superstition anymore as to why the world works the way it does. They're starting to figure it out scientifically. And there's all kinds of these people, right? Ben Franklin, Thomas Jefferson would be Enlightenment figures. Isaac Newton in the world of math and physics. Francis Bacon in the world of government and sociology, I guess is what we would call them. Voltaire in France. So this isn't just a British phenomenon. This is happening across Europe. There are Italians doing this, French, Spanish, even people in what will become Germany and the Netherlands. All kinds of figures trying to understand how the world works, why it is the way it is, and what is the best way to organize the world to bring about the most prosperity and the most peace to the most people, right? And of course, there's one figure that really kind of is above all of them. And it's incredibly important for the reason, or he's incredibly important for the reason why these American colonists feel they can oppose their government during the Stamp Act crisis, as it's known. This guy's name is John Locke. And he's going to develop what is going to become known as Whig political theory, right? It's a lot of his ideas are the underpinnings of how people think government should work and what government is responsible for. Right? And that's a big part of how Britain is going to run its government. And if you look at his lifespan from the 1630s to the 1700s, John Locke is very much involved when all of this stuff is happening that's going to come to determine how Britain works, right? He's born during that English Civil War. So he saw what happens when government doesn't work, how bad things can be. He's alive and well, excuse me. He's kind of in the full of his life when that thing called the Glorious Revolution comes along. He's one of the people saying we can choose who we want to run our governments. Even kings can be chosen. They're not put there by God. People choose to give them power and authority. We can choose to take it away as well. So this guy is incredibly important for a lot of reasons, right? He's one of the people saying, look, you want to have as tolerant a society as possible. People like William Penn are listening to him, right? People like John Locke are saying, look, you want to give people as much religious tolerance as possible. Who cares what brand of Protestant you are? Heck, who cares what brand of Christian you are, Protestant or Catholic? You should all be able to pray however you want, do things however you want, because that'll make our society stronger, not weaker, by allowing people to do what they want. And honestly, there's some truth to this, right? Look at what happened in New England. By trying to make everybody do the same exact thing the same exact way, their society kept splintering, creating new colonies, groups of people leaving, exiling, either because they're thrown out or because they decide to leave. A rigid society that's intolerant really doesn't survive long. It didn't work in New England. It's not working in Old England either. And John Locke is trying to point that out. What works best is being inclusionary, right? Letting people do their own thing. That's what the colony of Pennsylvania does, and it thrives. It grows faster than any other colony. So John Locke is an important figure here, really bringing things to the fore. But it's really in political theory that he shines, right? That his impact is the greatest. One of the things he points out to people is that naturally, just being born as a human being in the world means you have certain rights. Inherent rights is what they called it in the 17th and 18th centuries. He said that, look, you have a right to life, health, liberty, and the stuff you own, your possessions. Those should not be taken away from you by anybody. Nobody has the right to come and kill you. Nobody has the right to hurt you bodily. Nobody has a right to throw you in prison unless you've broken some law. Nobody has a right to take your things without your permission. And what John Locke tries to point out is the reason we have governments in the first place, we created kings thousands of years ago, was to actually protect these rights, to make sure that there's order so that when I walk down the street, somebody doesn't just kill me and take my stuff. The reason we get rid of kings is because if they take away our liberty, if they start trying to make us do things we don't want to do, they've gone beyond their powers. So John Locke starts trying to kind of organize all of these thoughts into one kind of coherent framework, and he does, right? Building on things like the Magna Carta and other, kind of philosophies from the ancient world and even all the way up through the Renaissance. He starts saying, look, this is the way a government really should work. You want a separation of powers. As a young kid, he saw what happens when a king is left unchecked. It's dangerous. It tears the country apart. It's also dangerous when you have just one body of government that has all the power, like Parliament under the Puritans and Oliver Cromwell. They can abuse their power too. He says what you really want are separations of powers, checks and balances. So one part of the government becomes corrupt, the other parts of the government keep it from doing damage. And then he said the big thing, that if a government becomes so corrupt that it's no longer doing its job, that it's threatening your life, your health, your liberty, or your possessions, you have a right to change it. You can rebel against it. If we get a bad king just because their father was king, we can get rid of them. Hereditary rule, John Locke would say, is stupid. You never know who you're going to get for king. What makes more sense is what we did in the Glorious Revolution. Choose a king and queen that'll agree to the rules. And if they don't, we'll get rid of them and get somebody else that does. So John Locke is an incredibly important figure here. These patriots that I just mentioned, they're using his ideas to justify their resistance to their own government. They're saying, look, this government has gotten corrupt, therefore I can resist it and make it change. And if it doesn't change, then we go to the next level and the next level. So John Locke is incredibly important, and he's really the guiding force behind a lot of what's about to happen in the British Empire, right? He sets the groundwork for a lot of this political theory that is going to be used over and over again. And that's what brings us to this next crisis, right? And no sooner is the Stamp Act crisis over, and a lot of people think, well, that's done, we're onwards and upwards, right? Comes this next problem. A person by the name of Charles Townshend has now become, essentially, it was called the Exchequer of England, right? Essentially, he's the head banker, what we would kind of think of as the Secretary of the Treasury. He's the guy that has to pay Britain's bills. And what he knows is Britain can't pay its bills. It's just not taking in enough tax money, and it can't pay its debt. So he knows they're in trouble. But he also knows that if they try to pass a direct tax, which will generate the most revenue, those colonists are going to get mad and things will go crazy. So here in 1767, Townshend tries to do what he thinks will make everybody happy. He'll gain revenue for Great Britain to pay its bills, but at the same time, he'll stay within the framework that we all agree is the way the empire runs. So he passes through Parliament a series of duties, taxes on goods. That's what a lot of colonists said you're supposed to do as a government, regulate trade. That it's perfectly okay to put taxes on items. The merchants pay those taxes, then they wrap up the cost of those taxes in the cost of the goods, and I, the consumer, pay the merchant. That's the way it's supposed to work. Townshend says, agreed, that's what we're going to do. I'm going to put duties on lead, paper, paint, glass, and tea. You, the individual, wherever you are in the British Empire, will pay these taxes through the merchants. We'll go back to the way things used to be. Townshend thinks he's found a workaround, that everybody's going to win here. Parliament is following the rules, and now the American colonists and really Britons everywhere will pay their taxes and get the country out of debt. It seems like that's the system, the way it's supposed to be. Well, in comes this American colonist. His name is John Dickinson. He's one of those Quakers that lives in William Penn's Pennsylvania. Now, William Penn is gone, but the colony remains, right? And John Dickinson is an important figure in Philadelphia. He is a lawyer and a really good one. And he's also been one of those patriots. He opposed the Stamp Act. He thought it was illegal and unconstitutional and too dangerous for corrupting influence in the British government. And now this new tax comes out, these duties on those 5 items comes out, and he says, you should oppose those too. in a series of letters, what we would today kind of call editorials in newspapers, Dickinson floods American newspapers with the idea that these duties are just as illegal as the Stamp Act. And that actually catches a lot of people by surprise. A lot of people understood why the Stamp Act was so dangerous because it was a direct tax. You, the individual, had to pay it even though you had no representation with the entity that was forcing you to pay that tax. Most people, regardless of how you felt about being British, understood that as kind of dangerous, as a game changer. But this is kind of shocking to a lot of people. They didn't understand why people would be so upset with this. This seemed to be normal, business as usual, if you will. But Dickinson says, no, we need to oppose these duties just like we oppose the Stamp Act. And he tells these patriots, you need to get out there and do it all over again. So what's going on here in this series of letters? They're called Letters from a Farmer. So Dickinson passes himself off as a farmer, even though he's a guy that lives in Philadelphia. He's a rich lawyer. He does own farmland, don't get me wrong, but he really doesn't live on farms and he doesn't make his wealth from farms. He owns land because that's how you show you're wealthy, right? That's how land is wealth in this colonial world. So Dickinson's trying to pass himself off as one of the people. I'm just like all of you guys, right? Most Americans are farmers at this time, but he very much isn't. But he is saying something in these letters, and one of them is kind of surprising. Within these letters, he does agree that the British government has a right to regulate trade. Well, that is kind of surprising because that is exactly what this guy, Charles Townsend, says he's doing. I'm regulating trade. I'm putting a tax on the duty on the goods, and the merchants are paying them just like you people say they're supposed to. So what is Dickinson's problem here? It seems like the British government is doing exactly what he says they can do, regulating trade, regulating the purchase of goods in the empire. So what's wrong with this? Well, he says, look, we're still not represented in Parliament, and this is just another tax. Well, some people say, yeah, but it's a duty, not a direct tax. And that's where Townsend says, or where Dickinson says, no, these Townsend duties actually are a direct tax. Because look at where the money goes. The money doesn't actually help us. The money actually is being used to send troops to India, to France, or to Canada, to the Philippines, so that the empire, so Britain, can defend those parts of the empire. What are we getting out of paying these taxes? Nothing. That these duties actually do prove that it's dangerous to work with the British government, right? And the other thing that he tries to point out is that these Townsend duties are essentially the same thing as the Stamp Act all over again. Even though merchants are paying the tax, it's still really a direct tax. It's really just aimed at us American colonists. Now, what he is not saying here is that it's impossible to reason with the British government. He does say that if we organize a boycott again, it worked in the Stamp Act, I think it'll work again. We'll get their attention and they'll change and they'll rescind these taxes just like they did the Townsend duties. But what he has to do first is explain how these Townsend duties are just like the Stamp Act to get people to rally around it and oppose these taxes like they did the last one. And this is where the real power of his penmanship comes from, is a political thinking, if you will. He points out that, look, to go back to this, right, I think it's on the next slide here, right? Dickinson says, look at what these items are. I can prove to you by looking at these items that this has nothing to do with regulating trade, and it's everything about raising taxes, raising money for the British government. He says, because look at what it is. It's lead, paper, paint, glass, and tea. All things that we American colonists have to import. And because we have to import it, we have to pay the taxes on it. If this was really about regulating trade, there'd be tobacco up there, there'd be furs up there, fish, timber, whatever. That stuff would also be taxed. But because those things go to Britain, they're not being taxed. Only the things that come from Britain that we have to purchase are being taxed. And that's where Dickinson gets a lot of buy-in. He points out that these Townshend duties are really just the Stamp Act dressed up in a different manner. A lot of these patriots come back out and say, you're absolutely right, we need to oppose these taxes just like we did the Stamp Act. They organize themselves and they talk about another non-importation agreement. But this time, Parliament doesn't back down. 1767, this non-importation agreement goes into effect. 1768, the British government says, let's see how long you can go without glass for your homes. Let's see how long you can go without drinking tea, our national drink. How long can you go without lead for paint? How long can you go without paint? How long can you go without paper? The British government sticks to its guns this time. So do the American colonists. And it's really mostly the American colonists this time. The rest of the empire says, you know what, we need this stuff, we're just going to pay it. It's not direct, it's a duty, so that's fine. But the colonists say, no, it really is a direct tax because it's being directed at us, right? We know it. We still haven't agreed to these taxes. This is illegal. So they organize this non-importation agreement. 1767, it goes into effect. 1768, it's still in effect. 1769, it's still in effect. Neither side is back down. 1770, it is still going on. And we can kind of see the longer this goes on, the harder it is to keep this going. And that's when the nature of these protests, the nature of this resistance changes a little bit. You can see it in this flyer that I have on the lower right-hand corner. This is a flyer that went up in Boston in 1770, pointing out that, hey, we need to stay with this agreement. We need to not buy British goods to teach the British government a lesson. So look at what's going on in this flyer. There's two things I want us to notice. First of all is the seriousness of this. That once again, they're kind of threatening people, telling you, hey, look, if we catch you, you're in trouble. So here they have a flyer that tells you about somebody that is actually trying to sell these taxed goods. His name is William Jackson. He's an importer. That's a way of saying a merchant, right? He's located at the Brazen Head, north side of the townhouse and opposite the town pump in Cornville, Boston. So one of the districts there of Boston is where this guy, William Jackson, is located. And if we see you going there to buy something, we know you're paying your taxes and you're not supporting the agreement, and we're coming after you or him. Now look at what they say also here. Something has changed that we need to recognize. It also goes on to say on this flyer, it is desired that the sons and daughters of liberty would not buy any one thing of this guy, William Jackson, for in so doing they will bring disgrace upon themselves and their posterity forever and ever. Amen. Now, it's kind of comical at the end, right, that they make this kind of a prayer, if you will. But there's something really novel here, something new that we need to kind of look at. And I hope you can pick it up. Not only are these guys serious, right? They're trying to say that, look, buying these things, paying these taxes gives authority to Britain. We can't do that because it'll never stop if we do. That is the same thing that they did in the Stamp Act. But there's something new here. It's not just sons of liberty that these patriots are calling themselves. There's also somebody else working with them. Daughters of liberty, right? They've expanded this movement to include women here, right? So ask ourselves why. Why are they bringing women into this? Well, there's an important reason. Women do a lot of the shopping for the household. They control the spending. And if you really want the buy-in of the community, well, women make up half the community. You're definitely going to need their help in keeping these boycotts alive. So here in the 1760s, this resistance is starting to spread. It's not just a few people kind of leading these things now. It's become a widespread movement. It has to be to keep going for so many years. So many people saying, I won't paint my house again this year. So many people saying, I won't fix that broken window. I won't drink tea. And then you have another factor to this. The timing, again, is really important. Remember, this is when that guy, Benjamin West, is painting that painting, The Death of James Wolfe, trying to remind everybody, hey, we're all British. We're all on the same side here. Let's not get too carried away. But there's something else happening as well. In 1768, the British government sent troops to Boston. They told the colony of Massachusetts Bay, we're sending troops that are going to be permanently based in Boston. You need to build a fort for them. You need to raise money to pay for feeding these troops because they're there to protect you. But the people of Boston, especially these sons and daughters of liberty, are saying, hey, wait a minute. We didn't ask these troops to come. We were not threatened by anybody. As a matter of fact, the only ones threatening us are these troops, because what are they really doing here? The irony of all of this is these troops are being sent to Boston to help collect these taxes, to help protect people like William Jackson and people paying their taxes. And who has to pay for these troops to come and protect the British government's interests? The colonists. They have to build the forts. They have to pay for food for these troops so that these troops can make them pay taxes to the government. This just makes them even more upset. And it's what leads to an important moment. Here in 1770, early 1770, this non-importation agreement amongst these colonists is breaking down. A lot of people are saying, hey, look, I have to paint my house pretty soon. It looks awful. I need glass for my windows and my doors. I need paper and tea. There's only so much we can get from outside the empire. I want those things. People are starting to go buy those things. And at the same time, after 3 years, there's a lot of British merchants that are screaming at Parliament, pull this tax back, man. Our economy is in shambles here. The British government is swimming in more debt than it ever has before. So both sides are in a precarious situation here in the winter of 1770. And that's when we have an important moment, right? This resistance has gotten pretty big. There are these sons of liberty running all over the place, threatening people that want to buy British goods, pay their British taxes with a lot of physical violence. There's a reason these troops are in places like Boston. Boston is one of the places where this is happening a lot, especially one of the most infamous of these practices of enforcing these embargoes, right, these boycotts, is tarring and feathering. That's shown right here in this flyer. But one of the best depictions of it comes from a TV show from a few years back, about 20 years actually now, called John Adams, about the second president of the United States and his role in helping create this country and being president, right? So I'm going to show you a little clip here on the screen. You're not going to be able to hear it really well. It's not going to look really great. But what we really are interested in is, what does it mean to be tarred and feathered? What does that look like? I'm not sure if this video is up on my YouTube channel, the Professor Creviston History channel. So if it's not, watch it here. I'm going to try and make sure that it's loaded into our course shell, but if it's not, you'll be able to see it here in this lecture video. Okay, so here it is. And it's not working. So of course, so what I'll do is, because it is a little bit long, it's about 3 minutes long, I'll have it available for you on my on the course shell. You should be able to find it in the chapter 5 course shell and be able to watch it there. It's a powerful thing, this tarring and feathering. It's publicly humiliating to the people that are tarred and feathered. You lose your status in society. And the fact that these patriots, as they call themselves, people like Sam Adams and John Hancock, think that they can do this to even government officials really tells you how much power they think they have. And it's also why the government of Great Britain thinks we need to send troops to keep this under control. This has a chance of spiraling out of control if we don't put our foot down here. So what's important, right, is what happens next. Here during this period, the resistance in the colonies, especially the American colonies, has really jumped up. What had been a united empire in 1763 has really fractured. A lot of American colonists, not all of them, but many of them are distrustful of their British government. They see it as being dangerous. Maybe not corrupt yet, but definitely dangerous. And they've opposed it. But that opposition is starting to fall apart. And there's a lot of tension in this society. It's only going to take one little spark maybe to really blow this whole thing up. And in March of 1770, there is that spark. There is this moment. There are 1,200 British troops in Boston now. marching the streets of Boston, trying to protect people like that importer, that merchant, William Jackson, who's selling British goods and paying his taxes. There are these British officials that are being attacked by these Sons of Liberty, being tarred and feathered. These British troops are trying to protect them. So in a big way, these troops become a symbol of British imperial power and authority, the government's authority, Parliament's authority. So they become a target. It kind of makes sense in a way, right? A lot of these Sons of Liberty, people like Sam Adams and John Hancock, use these troops as an example of the government oppressing the people of Boston. And they get a lot of the public to actually buy into this. They're so used to opposing the British government now after 5 years of this that they go along with it. They say that, yeah, these troops are here illegally. They're forcing us to do things we don't want to do. They start not attacking the troops, but yeah, attacking the troops, harassing them, calling the troops names as they walk down the street. And then one day, March 5th, early in the morning, there is this moment. Sam Adams and John Hancock have organized a big group of people to harass one unit of British soldiers, about 12 men marching down the streets of Boston. Suddenly, there's tens and then hundreds of colonists following these troops, shouting at them, calling them names, starting to throw things at them. It starts out as snowballs, but pretty soon it's rocks. And then the troops are being hit by other things like pieces of wood and clubs, right? There's all kinds of things happening to these troops. The troops get worried. They get to one of the town squares there in Boston, and the troops pull up and try to hold off this big, unruly group of people. There's several hundred colonists now threatening them, harassing them, hurting those British soldiers. Pretty soon, one of those soldiers shoots because either their finger slipped or they were hit or they were just scared they were going to be attacked by one of these threatening colonists. And of course, when one soldier fires, they all do. Pretty soon, there's 5 dead Bostonians and a bunch of other colonists that are wounded. The troops, many of whom are wounded themselves, run back to their fort, their barracks, to get away from the angry crowd. What has just happened here is British troops have just fired on their own people. Exactly what a lot of people like John Dickinson said could happen if this British government was not checked, if it continued to abuse its powers. It has now happened. And we have this moment, right? Here's an artist's rendering, a depiction of this moment called the Boston Massacre, done in the 1850s. It's actually based on eyewitness accounts of the massacre. And it shows kind of the reality of the situation. It shows a lot of these colonists are pretty threatening. They're trying to attack the British troops. They are hitting some of the British troops. The captain of the British troops is lying on the ground. He's been struck in the head by a flying rock. Several other troops have been hit and knocked down and are bleeding. And of course, as some of these colonists come up and start grabbing at the British soldiers' weapons, daring them to shoot, well, eventually something does happen. Somebody shoots and people are harmed. But in the reality of the situation, what we see here is a unruly mob in some cases, right? And that's how some people are going to describe it. It's a mob. Now, people like Sons of Liberty are going to say these are people protecting their rights. People that support the British government are going to say, no, this is a mob that's out of control and it's attacking British soldiers. They deserve to be shot at. But this is kind of what those Sons of Liberty, like Sam Adams, want. They wanted this moment. Remember, their non-importation agreement is falling apart. People are starting to give in and pay their British taxes. This is a way to kind of bring it home that the British government is dangerous and is trying to oppress you. They've got that moment that they want. And this is not the version of the Boston Massacre that goes out to other colonies, to the rest of the Massachusetts colony. It is this version instead. So what's different here, right? This is the version of the event that actually shows up in most newspapers throughout the American colonies. Actually gets back to Britain eventually even, right? That's the version that a lot of people back home in Britain are going to see of this thing called the Boston Massacre, right? So what's changed here? So let me go back to that one that's done from eyewitness accounts in the 1850, a pretty representative depiction of what went on there at that event. Here we see colonists armed, attacking British soldiers shooting. Some of the British soldiers are on the ground hurt. It looks like a chaotic mess, right? Do we see that here? Do you see British troops being attacked? Do you see colonists that are armed? Do you see British soldiers on the ground? Well, in this case, the captain isn't lying on the ground like in this picture. He's actually standing behind his troops, appears to be ordering them to fire. The troops, under no threat, actually fire and shoot at colonists that are just opposing, peacefully protesting their government's policies. In the end, this depiction of the Boston Massacre becomes the reality for a lot of American colonists. The British government is oppressive. The British government is attacking its own people. Another cleaner version of it is here in this. This is the actual engraving as it would have appeared before it went into a newspaper. So it's an incredibly important moment here, right? These Sons of Liberty have something to kind of energize the situation. We have a chance of this actually going from just resisting British policies to becoming an outright rebellion against British authority here in 1770. And then comes news that the Townsend duties have been repealed. Just weeks after this Boston Massacre takes place, we see the British government once again kind of backing down, encouraging these Sons of Liberty to resist British policies. Once again, the British government says, hey, we can come back with more taxes if we want in the future, but in reality, they need to get the economy going again. They need British merchants happy. The British economy is suffering here. So in the aftermath of this, there's a trial held where these soldiers are actually put on trial. Future President of the United States, John Adams, is asked to defend these British soldiers. Now, you would think that that's kind of a career killer for John Adams. But as a matter of fact, he does such a good job of being fair to the soldiers and pointing out that, no, we Bostonians were armed. We did attack these soldiers. That it's a few people in the mob that really went too far. The peaceful protesters were there, sure, but it's the people that went to the extremes that really caused the problems, not the British soldiers and not the protesters. Actually, the soldiers are found innocent of murder. And it makes a lot of Bostonians feel good about themselves. Here we are following British law. Here we are being good British subjects when our own government isn't behaving. We will still. But this Boston Massacre is going to have an important legacy, right? Not only does it make a lot of American colonists, especially those that weren't in Boston, fearful of the power of the British government and what those British troops in their streets might mean, but it also makes the British government worry about what their colonists might do, right? The fact that their colonists think that they can put British officials on trial anytime they want to really kind of says that the power dynamic is changing here, that these colonists think they're in charge and can do whatever they want. So what's been resolved here? Not a whole lot, right? Once the Townsend duties have been repealed, the economy starts picking up. Prosperity kind of returns, tensions kind of come down. But in the end, nothing has been resolved. Parliament still thinks it can do whatever it needs to run its empire, and American colonists think, well, no, you can't do whatever you want because that's not the way the system works. There are limits on British power and authority. So both of these things cannot be true, right? And it leads to another important moment. When you get down to it, who are American colonists most upset with? Who do they blame for most of these problems that have been besetting the British Empire since the 7 Years' War? And I'll give you a hint, it has to do with this person. So is it A, the king? Is it B, Parliament? Is it C, colonial assemblies? Or D, the French? And in the end, what you kind of see is it's actually Parliament. Most American colonists are still upset with Parliament and what it's doing. They're not really upset with the king yet, right? We haven't gotten to the point where we're at rebellion. This is still resistance. They want Parliament to listen to them. They want Parliament to stop its actions, but they're not saying we're not British. They're not saying you're not our government. We just want our government to listen to us and stop doing the things we don't like. So this is still about resistance here, even 8 years into this thing that we'll eventually call the American Revolution. But the lines are getting pretty hard here as well, right? One member of parliament kind of says after the Townsend duties, or before the Townsend duties go into effect, but after the Stamp Act has been repealed, he says, look, this parliament has and must have, from the nature and essence of the Constitution, a sovereign supreme power and jurisdiction over every part of the dominions of the state to make laws in all cases whatsoever. What this one member of parliament is saying, look, somebody has to run this empire. It has to be parliament because we represent the most important parts of the empire. After all, these colonies exist to serve Britain, not the other way around. It only makes sense that Britain gets to call the shots however it wants to. It's just the way the system is set up. And there's truth to that, right? That is the way the system has been set up. But a member of the Massachusetts Colonial Assembly also has a point. And his point was that this House, the Massachusetts legislature, has the same inherent rights here in Massachusetts that Parliament has in Great Britain. What he's trying to say is, look, since the beginnings of this colony, this legislature has made laws for this colony. And we've been the one passing direct taxes for this colony. People pay this legislature because they're represented in it. We are not represented in Parliament. We are not represented in the British government. There are two distinct levels of government here. So you kind of see both sides have a point, but both can't be right and make this empire work. It's one or the other. Either the colonies have power and control over themselves, or the British government has all the power and authority. It can't be both of these things. And that's what brings us to really the moment that is going to change everything. Because in the aftermath of the Townsend duties, the British government keeps kind of a figurehead tax in place. They've kept the tax on tea since repealing the Townsend duties in 1770. Is just kind of ceremonial, just saying, hey, look, we have the right to do this. Now, it didn't matter to American colonists because they could find tea other places. They could actually find cheaper tea from French, Spanish, or Dutch colonies. So they would go out and keep smuggling in foreign tea and not pay the tax on this tea, but they could buy everything else they wanted like they used to. So in the end, for 2 years or so, 1771, 72, things kind of went back to normal. Again, prosperity kind of returned, but none of these issues have been resolved. But in 1773, things change. An important entity, a commercial entity in the British Empire called the East India Tea Company is in trouble in 1773. It's about to go out of business. It deals in tea, but a lot of American colonists aren't buying its tea because its tea is expensive. Why is its tea expensive? Because they have to have an army and a navy to protect their interests, where they get their tea. You see, the East India Tea Company is based, well, in London, but its operations are in India, that colony that Britain took over from France in the 7 Years' War. That's where most of British tea is coming out of. And to protect that colony, the East India Tea Company needs an army and a navy, which means it spends a lot of money, which means its tea is really expensive. Well, American colonists won't buy it because not only is it taxed, but it's too expensive for them. So they'll go and find cheaper alternatives. Well, that means that the East India Tea Company is swimming in debt just like the British government. And if the East India Tea Company goes out of business, then the British government is going to have to send in troops, send in ships to keep the colony of India safe. That is just going to mean more debt for the British government. So they try to come up with a solution to this. Once again, one that they think will work for everybody here, the British government, the empire as a whole, and American colonists. What they decide to do is give the East India Tea Company a monopoly on tea. The only tea that will be sold in the British Empire is East India tea. But they understand that giving a company a monopoly means that it could be abused. So what Parliament decides to do in this thing called the Tea Act is not only say you have to buy East India tea, but that East India tea will be priced at the lowest possible price. It'll actually be the cheapest tea in the empire. And a lot of people say, well, that seems kind of fair. We're establishing a lower price, one that's affordable to everybody. The East India Tea Company gets to stay in existence, and the British government doesn't have to send troops and take control of India directly. That makes sense, right? It's a win-win situation. Everybody comes out ahead. Consumers get cheaper tea, the government wins, the company wins, everybody comes out ahead. Except these American colonists. They're so used to seeing danger from their British government now that they just think that this is, once again, a ploy. It's just a way for the British government to gain control over them. They've gotten so used to resisting British authority that now they can't see anything but resisting British authority. They're fearful that this Tea Act is just going to be the first of many tea acts, because in the end, this is still going to be tax tea. They're still going to be paying the British government. And if they pay the British government for this tea, then pretty soon it'll be some other colony that you have to pay a tax for to keep it going. And suddenly you'll be paying taxes on everything. And the other fact of the matter is that merchants like John Hancock, one of these Sons of Liberty, they make a lot of money by selling tea from the Dutch and from the Spanish and the French. That's a very lucrative trade for them. This threatens to put them out of business. So once again, these Sons of Liberty work up the colonial population. They say, look, we have to oppose this tea. This is just like the Stamp Act. This is just like the Townsend Duties. It's just a new version of all that stuff. And they do find that there's a lot of people that are willing to go down that road once again with them and oppose this tea. But they also find that there's a lot of people that are saying, I'll go ahead and buy it. It's cheaper. It's not a big deal. It's a duty. It's not a direct tax. I don't see what the problem is. So this is a pretty scary moment. These Sons of Liberty realize they've got a big problem on their hands, that the British government might actually win. And if they win, they're going to get that authority that says they can do whatever they want, whenever they want. So the Sons of Liberty keep organizing and trying to figure out how to oppose this importation of this tax tea, this monopoly tea, as they call it, right? So what they find is it's going to sell if it gets here. Once it shows up and gets unloaded on ships, merchants are going to sell it because it's cheap, and people are going to buy it because it's cheap. They're not going to care about paying the tax. So in Boston especially, where they're really more resentful of the British government than any other part of the colonies, but not the only place, right? They hold a series of meetings on how to keep this tea from getting sold to consumers. And the only real thing they can come up with is they try to get merchants to not buy it, but that won't work. The merchants are going to buy it. They try to get the authorities not to allow the ships to be unloaded, but the authorities say we can't stop it. It's legal. It's commercial goods. It has to be unloaded. We have no authority to keep it from getting unloaded. The best they can do is decide to destroy the tea, that if they destroy it, it can't be sold. So they hold a series of meetings all through November and December. And a lot of people in Boston are showing up to these meetings. Not just well-to-do people like Sam Adams, not just rich people like John Hancock that have a lot at stake here, that have been resisting British authority for a long time. Even guys like this guy, his name's George Robert Twelves Hughes. We'll hear about him in a couple more lectures. Even this guy, he's a poor shoemaker. He's not well-to-do. He barely has a business. He doesn't own land. He doesn't get to vote. Even he's showing up at these meetings. Even he's saying, you know, I see the problem here. I see that if we pay this tax, then next week it'll be a tax on paper again, and then it'll be a tax on paint and lead and glass, and it'll never end, and we'll just get taxed to death. He says, look, I'm poor as it is. I don't want to pay any more in taxes. I really do think that this is a bad thing that's about to happen. He agrees with these Sons of Liberty that tea needs to be destroyed. About 400 of these Sons of Liberty and people that work with them like George Hughes decide when these ships show up loaded with this tea that they're going to destroy it. So they have a meeting on the night of December 16th when the ships arrive in port, and they say, okay, now's the time. We got to destroy it before it gets unloaded. And they meet there in the middle of Boston in one of the big meeting houses there, and then they march from this middle of Boston down to the docks about a mile away, and all along the way, They are greeted by cheering crowds telling them, go destroy the tea, stand up for us, defend our British rights. And it's a pretty amazing moment if you stop and think about it. This is not secret. These guys have been meeting for months as how to oppose this tea. Most of the people in Boston know this is about to happen. The famous story is people like George Hughes dress up as Native Americans, and some might kind of wear Native American garb or regalia. But for the most part, these guys just wear scarves around their faces to hide their identities at least a little bit, but they're wearing their normal clothes. They're calling out their names to each other. Nobody really is hidden here. Everybody knows this is happening, which brings us to an important moment. Why don't British troops come out and just stop this? Go out there, guard these ships, and keep them from being attacked by this group of men. Well, the simple fact is they're afraid of another Boston massacre. They're afraid that once again this will get out of hand, British soldiers will shoot, and they'll have a bigger crisis on their hands. So the British Army doesn't get involved in this. These guys are free to do whatever they want. And what they want to do is destroy that tea. And they do. They go on board those ships, the crews get out of the way or sometimes help because they don't want to be attacked. And they destroy 342 chests of tea. And we don't mean little boxes. We mean chests as big as 3 feet by 5 feet by 3 feet, right? I mean, they're huge, right? 50 cubic feet of tea, and they're destroying them over and over and over again. 3 shiploads of tea are destroyed that night. The equivalent of $10 million in our terms today. It is a huge destruction of property. And for a lot of these people, like George Hughes, it is not just, they don't see themselves as destroying property. They see themselves as defending their rights. That night when George gets home, his wife asks him, and remember, they're poor. They really can't afford a whole lot. She asks, hey, George, did you happen to bring some of that tea home, right? So we can have some tea. And he says, oh, no, because if he brought home the tea, that makes him a thief, that he did this for his own personal gain. These guys destroy this tea because it's a political statement to them, right? They're trying to tell the British government, you don't have authority here to do this. You have to work with us, not over us. And it is incredibly powerful what's happening here. And it's something that we have to kind of keep in mind. Because years later, at the end of his life, when George Hughes is a 90-year-old man, he's one of the last surviving members of this thing that's going to be known as the Boston Tea Party. He's interviewed by a local Boston newspaper about what it was like that night, what he remembers from all those years ago that happened almost 70 years earlier. And George Hughes recounts that one of the clearest memories he has is who he was working with to destroy that tea. That he, the poorest man in Boston, or one of the poorest people in Boston, was working with directly the richest guy in Boston, John Hancock. They were working together to destroy this tea. And that's an important moment here, right? That's an important sentiment that's at the core of a lot of this resistance. People like George Hughes feel that their British rights are just as much as a threat from British actions as John Hancock does. Somebody that's got a big vested monetary interest in all of this. This thing is appealing to a wide swath of American colonists. Even somebody like George Hughes thinks he has British rights. Even if he doesn't own land, even if he doesn't have a lot of money and a lot of things, he feels that, hey, I have a right, that I do have a voice here, and it should be taken into account. This is an incredibly powerful thing that's happening in this resistance on this road to revolution. In the meantime, something else important has happened here. When news of this Tea Party, as it's called, or the destruction of the tea, reaches Britain, and it doesn't just happen in Boston. Boston is the biggest event, but New York destroys some tea as well. In Charleston, South Carolina, they capture the tea and lock it up in their jail. So they're afraid to destroy it because they might get charged for it or get in trouble. So they just kind of take it so nobody can sell it, right? But in the end, there's a lot of these tea parties that happens. It's just the biggest one is in Boston, and they destroy more tea than anybody else anywhere. So the British government gets news of this, and they're enraged, right? Lord North, the Parliament, right, the Prime Minister of England, says, look, whatever the consequences, we must risk something. If we do not, all is over. What he means is the whole point of having a government is to protect personal property. This is not government tea. This was East India tea. It was a private company's tea. The whole point of having a government is to protect your stuff. And on top of that, if these colonists can just destroy whatever they want whenever they want and nothing happens to them, then the British government really doesn't have any power or authority here. They've lost everything. So something has to be done. The British government has to teach these colonists a lesson. Even some colonists are thinking, wow, maybe we went too far here. People like George Washington are saying, this doesn't seem right. We shouldn't be destroying private property like this. That seems pretty radical and dangerous. But what comes next, the overreaction by the British government, really forces colonists once again to choose sides. And most are going to choose the sides of these Sons of Liberty, these patriots as they call themselves. They're going to see the British government as the dangerous side. So some things that we need to kind of keep in mind here. We're finally done. I promise we got through it, right? A couple things to keep in mind. These American colonists, what's at the crux of all of this is the change in the relationship between the colonies and Great Britain itself. Up until the 7 Years' War, those colonists were generally left to themselves. Yes, there were rules they were supposed to follow, but they almost never had to. So not a whole lot was asked of them. Now, they did their part when they felt they had to. They fought in wars with Great Britain. When they had to, they paid their taxes to Great Britain. But for the most part, they were left alone until suddenly they weren't. In the aftermath of the 7 Years' War, the nature of the British Empire changes. The nature of the British government has changed. It needs a functioning empire, and it needs all parts of the empire to kind of behave the same, including those American colonists. And those American colonists resist this change, this forcing on of imperial authority from Great Britain, from London. Driving a lot of this is the debt that Britain needs to pay off. But remember, it is more than just the taxes and the money. What is really behind all this is power and authority. Who has it? What are the limits to it? American colonists say there are limits to British authority and power, that these colonies have some power and some authority in and of themselves. The British government is saying, no, we have all the power and we can decide when and how to enforce it. Both of these things cannot be true. And we're about to see it in the aftermath of this thing called the Boston Tea Party. All right, that's where we're going to pick it up from next time. And until then, I'll see you.